This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, well, welcome everyone again to our ISI AI seminar almost every Friday. So today I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Yingtao Tian, who is a researcher from Google Brain Tokyo. Actually, he obtained his PhD in computer science at Stony Brook University before moving all the way to the Far East. And he's also one of the early day collaborator with myself. We actually collaborated several very successful works on graph representation learning, but now his interest is switching towards more still natural language and still generative model, but generative model for computational creativity. So today, I think he's going to talk about his works on understanding Japanese humanities through the lens of machine intelligence. So let's welcome Yingtao to introduce those very exciting, very fancy works he's doing in Google Brain.
Yeah, thanks, Mohao, for your wonderful introduction. So I can be heard, right? Nice.
Yes.
Yeah. So can I? Okay. So I think my screen is on the sharing. And hi, I'm Yingtao. Just a very recap of the introduction. I'm a research software engineer in Google Brain Tokyo. And in this presentation, I will going to be showing you some of our work in the direction of understanding Japanese humanities through the lens of machine intelligence. Quickly, we will be talking about two works. The one is called KaoKore, which is a pre-modern Japanese artificial expression dataset. And another one is the Ukiyo-e Analysis using attribute and geometry annotation, as well as the creativity application associated with that. So as you might notice, both work apply machine intelligence to the traditional Japanese humanity topics. And I hope this talk can shed some light on these interdisciplinary topics and provide some inspiration for the future works. The first part of the talk concerns, as the title suggests, KaoKore, a pre-modern Japanese artificial expression dataset. This is a joint work with my collaborators from Japan's National Institute of Informatics and other collaborators from University of Montreal and from University of Cambridge. And just very quickly go through the agenda for the first part of this talk, which I will be first briefly introducing the pre-modern Japanese literature, which is the background of this research. Then I will be talking about our proposed work, the KaoKore dataset. And this is followed by quantitative results as well as some creativity results that demonstrate the value of our proposed dataset. So let's start with the background, the pre-modern Japanese literature. In pre-modern Japan, there's a well-established narrative form for storytelling. Here, as you can see in the picture, stories are displayed entirely as one long continuous painting. Usually it is in the form of a picture scroll or a picture book. So here illustrated is a cropped page of the tale of the hollow tree. In Japanese, it's called Usuho Monogatari. This is a late 10th century Japanese story and presented here in the form of a picture book or the ehon that was produced later, which is 16th century. And as you can see, on the left, it has a cursive text that definitely is showing the story. And on the right is a story explaining paintings depicting many characters that is involved in the story. So this kind of form of art provides valuable material for the study of Japanese art history because they are like a different multimodality approach and angles that can be used in understanding this artwork. So recently, what we want to explore here is how to make the humanity research to benefit more from the machine learning. The reason we want to do that is that when we are discussing with the humanities researchers, one of the it's actually very commonly the response we get from our colleague in the humanities research is that they wonder what might be a good idea to think about the way machine learning can or cannot be used for the humanities research. In this direction, for example, we have some recent models being proposed for transcribing the historic Japanese cursive writing, which is usually a very hard task, even for trained human researchers. And as you can see, this model is like done by one of my collaborator in a separate work to the transcripting of this cursive writing. This is actually a good example of the relevant machine learning models having a direct and immediate impact on the society by working on a topic with a socially benefiting way with the social value that people might appreciate. However, there's a missing elephant in the room, which is the illustration and actually especially the faces. Since the facial expression often offers very rich information, not only about the content of what's been happening in the story, but also about how the artwork were created. This can be very useful for comparative style study, and it should also be benefited some way in machine learning. For example, whether we can know from how the faces are painted and what colors are used. In a way, we can discover not only how a story changes their form through history, but also how a story is being depicted, and such a depiction is evolving. So in this direction, there has been some work in the humanities research side to accelerate such kind of comparative study in the art styles. There's an effort called facial expression collection, and this is a public accessible project provided by the Center for Open Data in the Humanities, which is actually a lab in the Japan's National Institute of Informatics, with whom we are collaborating. With this like a open accessible project, we can build our work upon it. And the facial expression collection, and just to briefly cover it, provides a data set of the cutouts and the collected part of faces that are extracted from the artwork from the later Muromachi period or the 16th century to early Edo period or the 17th century. It also provides a corresponding metadata annotated by the researchers with the domain expertise. So given the success of applying machine learning into cursive writing recognition we showed before, we believe that the facial expression can also provide an opportunity for us to bridge the research of historical Japanese artwork with the machine learning research, but it has its own issues. And actually that is because this was designed for a human-facing, like a researcher-facing tool instead of designing for machine learning. So there are lots of issues, including like a data format, image sizes, etc., that prevents an easy adoption of the machine learning models. So that's the background of our work. And now let's move to the next part, which is the data set we are proposing. The reason we want to propose this data set is to bridge this gap. And to build upon the facial expression collection, we propose to make a machine-friendly data set. And name-wise, we call it KaoKore, which is short for the facial expression collection in Japanese. Our proposed KaoKore dataset contains more than 8,000 colored. It makes the resulting dataset easy to use with off-the-shelf machine learning models and tools. And besides the images, it also contains a full metadata labeled by experts with the specific domain expertise. So in this example, as you can see, it contains the year of creation, the gender, and the social status. And of course, to make it useful for supervised machine learning, we provide two sets of labels for all these faces the gender and the social status, which belongs to the frequently appearing subset of all these kind of expert annotated data. It should be noted that all this data, although it's being annotated by modern experts, are following the traditional, the historical interpretation of these semantics. For example, in the historical interpretation, for gender, we only have the male and the female characters, and for social status, here we only have the noble, warriors, incarnation, and commoners, which are often the subject of the stories being depicted in these picture scrolls. And we also, for the supervised learning, provide some official training, developing, and testing split so that we can allow the straightforward comparison of different machine learning models. That's about the data set we proposed based on the foundation data sets. And now we want to show the value of our data set through two types of experiments. The first type is called a quantitative classification result, which basically just show the supervised learning task being asked to classifying the gender and the social status. So here, in detail, the machine learning models are required to classify whether a given image is a male or female character and the character social status. So we show the result of several commonly used neural networks, which are able to achieve decent but imperfect performances. So definitely the newer and the larger architectures achieve better performances, but they still do not get it perfectly right. So we believe this data set provides some room for future improvements in the machine learning model side. For example, it can be a benchmark for semi-supervised or transfer learning, so that because this data set has its own style, it has a moderate but not too large size. So it poses some resource, and it is a resource, but also poses a challenge for the machine learning model side. Maybe more importantly, since KaoKore dataset itself is based on the artworks, we want to investigate its creativity applications. So in this sense, we want to see if the humanities researchers can find a novel way of engaging this dataset artistically. So a good way to do that is to use definitely a good performing generative model. So actually what we first try explore is the generative adversarial network, or GANs, which has been successful in synthesizing the high quality images. So in this task, we leverage a style GAN, which was one of the state-of-the-art GANs at the time of writing, but arguably now with the developing and with more and more better these high fidelity image generation models being proposed, there are definitely already better models. But we can show that even at the time of writing, that time the state-of-the-art GAN already could achieve very decent result, as we show here. It seems that all of these ancient faces generated by the GANs have been high enough fidelity, which can cause a surprise for our humanities researchers. So we can show an infinity number of generated faces here in this slide. From these faces, we can show a very diverse yet coherent style generated from this model. So we actually hope this can show a different approach to the art through machine learning, because we are presenting these generated artworks that are artistically feasible, but are not a real thing. So what this counterfactual data brings us, if we can call it a counterfactual thing, is very interesting and open to interpretation for the humanities researchers. So we can compare the generated and the real data. There's still some room for improvements, but we can already see it achieves a balance between the diversity and the visual qualities. Okay, let's move to another thing. The GAN models are being able to generate plausible looking images but fundamentally, all the GANs directly generate pixels. So this is different from how a human artist might paint an illustration, since an artist would paint an image by putting stroke iteratively on a canvas. So therefore, when a GAN makes a mistake, the type of error it makes are quite different than what could be produced by a human painter. So to give this synthesized process a more art-like inductive bias, we consider stroke-based rendering, which produces basically a reference image by sequentially drawing primitives, such as simple strokes, and these drawing primitives are being put on a canvas iteratively. As you can see here, this work is characterized by the lack of style loss in the overall architecture, so which in turn expose the intrinsic style of each painting primitives that looks like a pencil drawing style. So it can be observed that this images has been decomposed into strokes that resembles how a human artist might create this painting and with pencil sketches. And yeah, that's basically an image of all these kind of paintings. We also explore another work which is called Learning to Paint by Huang et al. This one is a unique neural painting model trying to approximate the images using very simple regions marked by the quadratic Bezier curves. And this model aims to use such kind of regions as few as possible. So we show here that this model generates the sequences of painting vividly, but much different than the previous cited model. So this shows that the produced curve region actually learns a way to approximate the painting in a pretty abstract way. And this emphasizes the general arrangement of the objects rather than the details. So we believe that these two explored painting model can give us some samples of the fundamentally different learning mechanism can be leading to like a different generated image, the generated image with different styles. And our hope is that by exposing different styles induced by this machine learning model, we hope the human research can also address it and get some insight from what can and cannot be get from artistically from this data. Finally, we put the data and all the code available online, and in the future we will be keeping improving on this data set by increasing the number of facial expression images in the data set. We would also be continually working with these Japanese institutes and university to get more data for that. We can also construct new data set for Japanese art beyond the face image considered in this data set. And actually, we will be covering some of these following up work that also falls into the realm of Japanese humanities research with machine intelligence. And which is the second part of my talk here. I will be in this part, we will be covering the Ukiyo-e Analysis and Creativity with the Attribute and the Geometry Annotation. And again, this work is a joint work by me and my collaborator from Japan's National Institute of Informatics. We also start this part with a very quick overview of the Ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e is actually a genre of Japanese art that was popular during the Edo period of Japan. The Edo period of Japan is 16th century to the 19th century. It contains paintings and actually more broadly speaking, the woodblock printings of these paintings. Unlike the ehon and the picture scrolls we discussed in the previous part of this talk, the ukiyo-e covers more daily topics like animals, peoples, or for example, the dramas. Unlike the ehon we mentioned, it covers more the stories. Because it is produced by printing using wood blocks, the ukiyo-e enables such a large scale collection. which provides a huge and valuable corpus for the study of Japanese art. We can see a large collection of ukiyo-e not only in Japan's museums, Japan's universities, but also in many Western institutes, which also host such large collection. Then, we also care about a thing called artwork study. So the artwork study is where we want to also apply the machine learning and the data-driven method to improve it. And the reason is that the artwork study concerns many things, but there are two aspects that I think are pretty close to the machine learning approach, like computer vision, which are the object and the style in the art. So the object can be, for example, the outline, the shape of depicted figures, and it is useful for art study since it reveals the trend of objects being depicted over time. The style concerns the texture and the color, which actually are the fine-grained details in the painting, and how the artist make these details helps identification of the said artist in the history study. There are two kinds of previous works in this direction. The direction of combining the artwork study with some computational or data-driven approaches. One, for example, looks at the geometric properties of the Buddhist sculpture to predict the original region and the production date of the said Buddhist sculpture. Another kind of this work actually extend from studying to creativity. In that sense, the artist can use this work to convert, for example, a ukiyo-e to another genre, such as photorealistic faces. And this can be also I think it has been applied online, so people can try it as a filter or something in their selfie apps. To summarize, our contribution in this work, it can be done as follows. So first, we propose a large-scale dataset with semantically valid labels, and then we conduct the quantitative study into the ukiyo-e style, which what we are doing is to quantifying these semantic labels and the geometry annotations. We then using a machine learning-based color segmentation to study the ukiyo-e style too. And finally, we jointly study the object and the style of the ukiyo-e and using a color segmentation. So that's basically what we will be covering in the second half of this talk. And as this, we should start with the dataset and the analysis, since we definitely need some data to make these things happen. And based on the experience, the lessons we learned from the previous work, the dataset is very still build our work on top of two foundation datasets. And one of them is collected by the Ritsumeikan University and contains the images of ukiyo-e and some of the associated metadata, like the title, like the painter, etc., which are annotated by the domain experts. We also incorporate another dataset produced by Pinckney, which consists of only faces, high-quality faces image of ukiyo-e, but we also find it useful, although it doesn't contain the metadata. To help with the human research, we want to have a more like a data associated with the ukiyo-e rather than just a scanned version, a digitized version of ukiyo-e. In this direction, we use a facial landmark detection that can identify the landmarks for particular figures. For example, it shows like this model can output the facial region and possibly more than like one landmass for each of the region. And this region can be used to extract the parts of the faces or having a better placement of the faces from the original image. Here are the example of most faces being annotated with these landmarks. although the model for face detection are definitely presumably trained and for photorealistic human faces, they are actually producing very good quality in the detection for the Ukiyo-e paintings. So in that way, we also incorporate the semantic labels that we mentioned were originally from the metadata, from the dataset produced by the Lismekan University. There are several aspects of the metadata, such as the authors, the production year, like there are all more art-specific terms such as the form, the format, or even some of the, like if it's a poster for the Edo period, like a theater show, what's the actor. But we only show two very important parts here. And the first one is the author. As you can see, there's a name succession system in traditional Japanese art, which basically means a student takes the teacher's name and becomes the next generation of the said name. And then, for example, we can see there are 3 Kunisada generations. Another aspect is the production years. There are 3 waves of ukiyo-e production as revealed in our dataset, which were in the early, middle, and the late 19th century. By looking at each author's exemplary paintings, we definitely can see some particular aspect of how the paintings were made by this artist. We can discuss a lot, but maybe due to time constraint, we won't dive deeper here, but they are pretty interesting. And then here comes our main part, which is the study of ukiyo-e objects using the geometry features. Using the geometry features, we conduct a large-scale analysis of how the paintings were made. Previous works has been done on a limited number of paintings, like only 50 or so, but in contrast, we extended it to roughly 20,000 paintings, which is much, much more. And since some landmarks are better than others, we select a small subset of landmarks of high quality, as we show here in the green. The criteria we use for selecting the high quality landmark is done by comparing the predicted landmark with the landmark labeled by, we ask the domain experts to also label. So by comparing the machine and derived landmarks and the human labeled landmarks, we know some landmarks are systematically better than others. So then we select these landmarks and using the angles formed by the triplet of this landmark as the geometry features for the faces. So that's basically by selecting these landmarks, and we can form many, many triangles. And the angles here are used as a feature. So having done that, this actually shows some very interesting results. For example, we can do a projection of these features into 2-dimensional spaces using either like unsupervised method like PCA, T-SNE, or UMAP, or the supervised method like LDA. Most of the authors here are similar in terms of their like the painting's geometry, but actually 2 of them stands out. They are Kunisada and Kogyo and Hirosada. Kogyo is a painter that paints well into the 12th century, which is after the Edo period, and he was largely influenced by contemporary Western painting at that time. Hirosada represents the art style in actually the Western Japan. So although the name Edo period in Japan, the Edo is a name for Tokyo before the modern time. Actually, in that time, Japan has 2 separate cultural centers, one in today's Tokyo and another in today's Osaka and Kyoto. And the second outstanding author we identify here, Hirosada, belongs to the Western Japan school. And we also show some of these like exemplary paintings to better illustrate they are like the faces they are producing are different. So as you can see, the Kogyo's faces are more modern, and the Hirosada has its own particular styles, which is particular to the Western Japan's art school. So here we also compare the ukiyo-e, not only compare the authors producing ukiyo-e, but we compare the ukiyo-e with two other art representation style faces. The one is the home or the KaoKore dataset we discussed before. This kind of work, as I mentioned, is a kind of artwork earlier than the ukiyo-e. And another one is photorealistic, human faces, which I just find yet another maybe a random data set for comparison. We conduct the same unsupervised dimension reduction of their geometric features, and we can observe the clear separation of these genres. So furthermore, we can see the Ehon has a more clear and separated style of depicted faces than the ukiyo-e. Both are in turn pretty different from the photorealistic human faces, which we use the FFHQ dataset here. So this shows that the Japanese art, although itself as a way of depicting humans, intrinsically has gone through drastic changes, like from the Ehon to ukiyo-e, but it still keeps a distant manner of rendering when we compare them to the realistic photos. So now let's move to the next part, which is what we did to study the ukiyo-e style through the color segmentations. The first question is that why we want to do the color segmentations. The reason is that the very way ukiyo-e is printed, as we mentioned before, ukiyo-e was printed using separated wood blocks, and each wood block is for a different color. So the wood blocks are actually very vulnerable, and they were often discarded after several batches of production. So as a result, we have lots of ukiyo-e nowadays, but not the wood blocks used to print them, because once a wood block is worn out, it can get discarded, and it can also maybe just be reused. So to do so, as a result, we want to know and infer actually the original wood blocks configuration for the sake of humanities researchers. We frame it as a soft color segmentation problem, which decomposes a given image into several layers, where each pixel might be belonging to possibly multiple layers. And here we decompose, as an example, an ukiyo-e, the whole painting or the faces painting, by first inferring the color palette from the painting, and then we can use the soft color segmentation method to decompose them into several layers of homogeneous colors. We finally can reassemble these layers, and the reassembled result look pretty like the original one. This shows that our separation is a correct one. This kind of segmentation enables further creativity. For example, we can adjust the images by recoloring the layers with either a color palette inferred from other ukiyo-e paintings, as the second and the third column shows, or manually pick color to form a palette, such like the fourth column shows. And finally, we also want to do something to study the ukiyo-e's object and style. We propose to study them jointly by composing the sketches and the colors. As we mentioned earlier, the objects and the styles are important aspects of the artworks. There are actually many ways to interpret this argument, and it's actually an open problem. But one of them that are plausible is to interpret the object as what is being depicted, which we represent using line sketches, and also to interpret the styles as the colors and the textures used to render these objects. So these two can be decomposed and rejoined later in a semi-orthogonal way. For example, given our original image, we could extract its sketches and use another painting as style references. And finally, we can get a colorized images is actually as a result of the colorization model. Here, it shows a very interesting way to interpret both objects and the images. Sorry, the object and the styles in the images, and is able to produce the results that are unseen, but still makes artistic sense. Given this tool, we can now compose the object and style in an orthogonal way. So as we enumerate all the combination to form a matrix, when we make a new combination, we are now able to make something that's artistically valid, but not seen in the data set before. As color actually represents some kind of semantics, our works enables a further study on how the impression of ukiyo-e painting changes with a different combination of object and style. For example, we might find a warrior is never painted in the same way as a court noble women, but such a combination, when produced by this model, is still making the artistic sense because it's not the details are correct. So what makes this gap, and what kind of semantic information that is carried by particular style is here, and how they must be work well, being aligned with the objects, is something that our model can propose and can let the produce this kind of samples to let humanity researchers to study. We also extend this kind of composition into the whole ukiyo-e paintings, where our pipeline still works well and the conclusion still holds. We can also apply our pipeline in the colorization of the in-the-world wood block printings. So here results are from the colorization of the in-the-world wood blocks, which are like the scanned version of some existing wood blocks. These results are okay, but of course they are not perfect. They are not as good as we showed before. So here we realize that there's still a long way to go in this direction when this kind of combination of the style and the objects can be applied in the world, like making an app so everyone in the museum can do the same colorization thing. So there's still a long way to go, and it invites future researchers. So in a conclusion, in this part, we apply the machine learning to the art research. We present a large-scale dataset of ukiyo-e images, which is accessible publicly online. And we push forward the humanity style by proposing a quantitative, data-driven machine learning approach. And thank you for listening. If I want to give a very short conclusion of all the works, including but not related to the works I presented here, is that the interdisciplinary research of humanity and machine learning is something that's a pretty unique. It itself needs some kind of creativity idea to find a way where both sides are happy. So it's often it seems like it's hard to find an intersection between these two disciplines. But if you are creative enough, you can find you definitely can make something, and then people from both community might say, okay, that's cool. That's something we could try. So yeah, thanks, and that's everything I have for the presentation and today. If you have any question, please just ask. As Mohan mentioned, we can move to the Q&A session.
Yeah, thanks.
Right.
So really, the talk is amazing, and also those works are amazing. And I totally agree with the your view on the value between the intersection of creativity, humanities, and also ML. I think we should just do more efforts on those AI for the common good research. Yeah. I think there's one question already from Kenji Yamada. So I think that question is probably about the second part of your talk. So can you see any influence among painters throughout the long period of time?
Oh, should I click the answer live button? Oh, yeah.
I guess you can just.
Okay. So I actually, to be honest, I'm a little bit confused on like among pointers through the
No,
long
actually
period.
painters, I guess.
What? So
So,
painters through
painters.
long. Oh, I see. To be honest, I think that's a good question. We didn't think.
Oh,
We did
printers.
printer. Let me see how to frame this question. I think there are something we want to we attempted to study over the time. For example,
No, actually painters.
painters. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we attempt to like study like the changes of style through the as the time changes, either through a humanities point of view or using the computational approaches. But our very primitive finding is that a painter's style is more correlated. It's hard to say the causality, but speaking of the correlation, it's pretty related to the time the painter was on. So for example, a painter might follow his or her like a teacher's style, but it's also getting changing and getting like a more and getting more aligned with what a contemporary that time the art calls. But I think one of the example would be like the artist who paint well into the 12th century. That although it's a Japanese like a painter, his painting shows lots of like a modern paintings influence. So I think like the influence between painter over a long time, there could be some, but we find that might not be the first order like influence. The contemporary art, the contemporary cause for the art style might influence more on a painter's decision of the arts. Okay, shall I do the second question?
Yes, thanks. Actually, the second question from David John is also related to that question I want to ask as well. So David asked, how do you do soft color segmentation? I think that's probably a question related to both parts of your talk, because for the first part specifically, I also wanted to ask, because you are doing those by stroke generations, and over there, really how do you decompose the strokes from what seems to be continuous in the paint?
Okay, yeah. So actually, I think the questions that Debbie asked and Mohao you are mentioned, they all point to like to the core of how this can be done. It seems not to be very like straightforward, but since they actually are having they're much different mechanism underlying, so I will be answering this your question and David's question one by one. So for like the painting, the stroking, so this kind of work usually are framed as a reinforcement learning problem, where the canvas is an environment and the action is to put something on the canvas, like putting a stroke on the canvas to change the environment. So by framing it as a reinforcement learning, so that's a bigger frame. And in the smaller granularity, such kind of model also tries to learn a neural network model to approximate like the output of a stroke. So the hope is that because the painting, if you want to do an end-to-end like optimization, you want to have like a gradients being back propagate. Although in the reinforcement setting, you might depends on the reinforcement algorithm you are using, you might have less requirement for the gradients. For this neural painting method, it's still they still care about the gradients. So, but they're facing the challenge in like it's hard to define like what's the gradient with respect to like for example your input parameters. So either like the first the style, the first one without a style loss, it's basically like a surrogated function to approximate a painting, or based on the Bayesian curves, which are very simple region, and there could be also a very simple like a neural network to approximate. So basically, they are using the approximated neural network and as an policy network in the reinforcement learning setting. So that's how they actually are doing that. To be honest, I know it's a little bit not obvious from the first look, but surprisingly they work not bad. Of course, they opens many like a question to how to deal with more complex painting, because neural network often can only deal with very simple strokes, and how to deal with like the long term like planning. And but basically, I think that's how they are working, and that's a very particular direction to do the painting. The second question is about do soft segmentation. Yeah, I'm using a existing method. The name is very straightforward. It's called a faster soft color segmentation. And in that work, basically what they are doing is to using a so the color segmentation is can be done reasonably well without deep learning actually, because there are lots of you can do lots of classical approaches you can do. For example, you can make a cluster of the pixels like for example, the pixels color in the color space. You can define a distance in the color space, and then you can do the clustering, and then using the clustered pixels to pick different regions in the painting. However, that's not doing it in a softer way. From my understanding, the faster soft color segmentation introducing a neural network to help to better segment if you are given, for example, the clustered pixels in the color space. They try the model try to get a better like segmentation by placing them into different layers, consider some local like features. So it's not a very mechanically simply taking like the nearest color of the pixel and put it in that layer. So that the paper I can answer is, shall I just type in the? I can type the answer is like the.
Yeah, you can type in the chat, or if you happen to have the link, you can probably, or you can actually send out the paper. I can send to the Slack channel later if you cannot immediately grab that. But I think that's fine.
Oh, okay, I can put on the like a chat.
Oh yeah.
Yes, segmentation. Yeah, this is the work I'm using.
I see. Yeah. You know,
yeah.
I'm not sure if that's also related to, because originally I was thinking, you know, just on the paint. But okay, for example, while we look at the paint, although you know we know that that was painted stroke by stroke, if that's a real paint, but really the strokes are kind of continuous to each other. So really, I'm not sure on each paint how do you really segment the stroke, or is that based on some kind of heuristics, or really there are some annotations for that?
Basically, the stroke is placed in a way to minimize the L2 loss between the current canvas and the target. So the model is forced to place the stroke in a way that it makes the canvas looking more like the target one. So that's basically the new so-called neural painting method I'm working on. There's another thing which is also unrelated, so I have to say it as a third point in David's question on how the algorithm-based landmark generation and the manual annotation. Basically, what we are doing is that this is what I say. These questions expose a very important issue in the humanity research versus with computation approach, which is a lack of high-quality data. Because we only have very limited experts who are able to have time to label this data, and there's lots of labeling cannot be easily done by, for example, by crowdsourcing because of background knowledge requirement. So what we are doing as an initial attempt in this works is to simply we apply something trained for other data domain. Like the landmarks are a model trained for human faces, and then we learn we having some very small collection of experts annotation, and using that to filter out the landmarks with better qualities. So this can be served as a like a low budget effort to get some data, some landmarks, such kind of annotation. That is for the artistic data set, but not from like a real world one. One thing we are doing, we are working on now is to can we get in more like a human in the loop for example, to address this issue so that we can collect this data with more experts input in mind. I think that is an open problem, and that open problem is not only what we want to do, but the whole digital humanity research community want to focus on. I think that might be even not limited to the humanity research, but also in many places where if you are if the topic of the data you are researching on is a little bit niche, so how to get a high quality annotation to get better than the unlabeled unsupervised learning, I think that's always an open problem, and it needs a different kind of way to deal with them, depends on your situation. Yeah, I think David, for this this good question, they involves many details, but that's a life because details, evils are in the details.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway I get from here is that the segmentation model is actually transferred from models that are trained on real human faces, and there's some small collections of expert annotation to do this kind of low resource transfer or even filtering. I see.
Yeah, let's follow-up question from David saying, do we need to retrain a soft color segmentation neural network? No, we don't. Because although this work is trained on a landscape data, we find that it actually works pretty well for the painting. And my understanding is that the color segmentation is more like a signal processing problem instead compared to being more like a deep understanding problem. So I think maybe by definition it has better generality across different kind of domain.
I see.
And do we annotate how do you annotate the data? In the work I present, there are lots of data, and when we do annotation, there are lots of annotation. Often they are done by digital humanities using a platform called IIIF, which is very popular in the digital humanity. Let me search community. So this is a platform that helps the researchers for annotating. Yeah, hope that answers all the questions.
Yeah, and also, by the way, to me, is I understand that the humanity arts are fantastic, but I'm more into those things like yokai, which means monsters or ghosts in ancient Japan. There are lots of paints for those, or printers for those. But I'm just out of curiosity. Are you, or your office is planning to work on that area of ancient art?
Yeah, there are lots of ancient Japanese art that are pretty interesting. As you probably already noticed, the first part of my talk, they are nobles, they are incarnation, they are more yokai. Right. The second one, the ukiyo-e, because ukiyo-e in general is more for this life. Ukiyo in Japanese is a literal form for this world, and as its name suggests, it covers more daily topics. But for the yokai, the more myth one, I think we are also interested. Actually, when we decide what to work on, it's we are, of course, we have our preference. We want to work on more monsters or more noble paintings, but we also need to consider one thing, which is the availability of data, because all this data we have done I mean, the collaboration of our work with like other Japanese institute makes it possible to work on some data set. And each institute has their own like collection of data. So it's more like a salesman. We need to talk to them. We need to discuss like a research, the research, what data we want to deal with, what like a research project we want to, or direction we want to follow on. So besides what we also want to do, we also need to consider like the availability. For example, the Ukiyo-e is by the University, which when we reach out and we find that there's a big connection. For the earlier one, we also have some connections. So I think we are now reaching out to many like institutes trying to get more like a selection of data from projects we can do. But we'll let you know when we have more yokai in the collection.
Yeah, hopefully. And I understand you know, another challenge is probably when you study on yokai, there's probably not something that is obvious for you to transfer from. Right.
Yeah, that would be a very culture specific topic.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, one thing I want to add is that when we do such kind of interdisciplinary research, is often we are asked to be careful when it's related to, for example, the religious figures or like mystic figures. And I think that's a legitimate requirement, and we definitely should do that. And because that's many people care a lot about. But that also gives us some like a new like a how to say angles to look at many problems. For example, one work I cited is to investigate the Buddhist sculpture, which also helps the identification. There's something that people care. There's something people might have been like overlooked, but I think they are all places where our computation work can help.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for this, well, very informative discussion, and also those works are really impressive. So I guess, you know, we are about to reach the end of this seminar, and I can't wait to have more discussions with you during the one-on-one meetings. But yeah, thanks again for, especially, you know, it's your midnight to early morning time in Japan. So really, that is a lot of passion, and we appreciate you a lot for giving this talk during this, you know.
I'm honored to have the discussion too.
Okay. Thanks. So see you soon, very shortly.